to smile to myself as we were singing Happy Summerland of Bliss, because Teresa told me this morning that the mountains around our house in upstate New York are expecting 6 inches of snow today. So much for the Summerland of Bliss, right? But again, that's one of the things you learn to deal with, the possibility of having snow in April. When I was a kid and used to watch The Price is Right, and people would win snowmobiles, I thought that was so dumb. Why would somebody win a snowmobile that you can use for like 1 or 2 days out of the year? And now I find out people actually ride them 6 months out of the year. So I have a snowblower, y'all. Those are a blast. But it is really good to be with you. It's good to be able to share the gospel with you and be encouraging to you. And you've been encouraging to me. And I hope that these lessons and our time together has been an encouragement to you. And we have 2 more nights. When somebody says, hey, you can take Friday night off if you want, I kind of get the hint. So I said, okay. But no, really. It is a help to us to be able to get back home on Friday and get ready for Sunday. And some of y'all know I've got a lectureship that starts on Monday, and so that is going to be helpful to me. So even though it is a little shorter, thank you for that. But again, it's just been wonderful to be with you. Last night we talked about the faith of Elijah, looking at 1 Kings chapter 18. And tonight we're going to kind of look at the other side of things from 2 Kings 19. And we talked about how Elijah's faith in chapter 18 brought courage, victory, and glory. And one of the things that we talked about, and I wanted you to get from that lesson, is to understand that if we're going to fight against Satan in our world today, that we're going to have the same kind of faith, we're going to have to do the same kind of things. But it's still easy for us to get discouraged. Knowing those things are true, knowing God is with us, knowing God gets the glory, it's still easy to get discouraged and maybe even depressed at times. And sometimes it even comes after we've had these great victories, where something really cool has happened, something really great has happened, really encouraging has happened, and then lo and behold, along comes this new thing that just knocks our feet right out from underneath us. And that's exactly what Elijah faced in the next part of this story. One of the things we did not read last night was how after this, Elijah goes up onto the mountain with Ahab and he makes it rain. God had told him 3.5 years before this that it would not rain on the earth until Elijah called for rain, and that he wasn't to call for rain until God told him to. And so now he's had this great victory. And God has told Elijah to call for rain, and it starts raining on the land for the first time in 3.5 years. And then this happens. Let's begin reading in chapter 19, verse 1. It says, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more so, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. He's depressed. He's feeling discouraged. Again, he just had this great victory at Mount Carmel, but now word comes to him from Jezebel, I'm going to make you just like one of them. And he is depressed. And again, it's easy to understand seemed to be going so well. It seemed like he won this huge battle over the false gods. He won this huge battle over Satan. I can imagine that he thought this was going to be the turning point in the history of Israel. You know, Israel is not that old of a nation at this point. The separate kingdom, the northern kingdom, is not that old. And then maybe you think, okay, we're going to get things back on path here. We're going to get rid of the Baal worship. Next will be getting rid of the calves that Jeroboam made, and we're going to be okay. And then lo and behold, here's Jezebel showing that she still wields power. So he thinks it's all for nothing. All of this has been for nothing. So it says in verse 5, and then as he lay and slept under the broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." Then he looked, and there was at his head a cake baked on the coals in a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank. And he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So Elijah said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken the covenant, and torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." You can see, even after the angel visiting twice, he's kind of still in this same place mentally. Just take my life, God. I'm useless. It's useless. He's discouraged. And again, I think we look at that, we understand why he's discouraged, and we can see that we sometimes get discouraged for the same reason. One of the reasons he is discouraged is because of the inconsistent behavior of people. In verse 4, he says, "I'm no better than my fathers." What does he mean by that? Well, what he means by that is God is, Elijah is not the first prophet of God. Other prophets of God have come along and tried to get this people to do what they ought to do, and what do every time? I mean, for us, we read this and we're like, yeah, this is what Israel does. Israel they just continue falling. But imagine you're dealing with it. The kind of the hardest trial ever is the trial that you deal with yourself. And so here's Elijah. He thinks today's going to be different. And lo and behold, the people are just as inconsistent. Because remember what they said at the end of chapter 18 and verse 19? "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And they helped him execute all those prophets. And now, what's going on here? I know how that feels. Think about that brother in your life, that sister in your life that you've worked with. They struggle. You've worked with them, and man, all of a sudden you see them look like they're turning the corner. And it's like, oh, this is great. This man, he is living up to his potential. This is what we always want. And then boom, one day he's gone again. You're like, what in the world's going on? Or have you ever studied with somebody, and it's like you teach them something, and they get it, like, I know Teresa studies with this lady who doesn't believe Jesus is God, and she, maybe she'll study with that lady, and the lady says, "Yeah, I can see that, I can see that, I can see that." And the next week she comes back, and you know what? I don't think Jesus is God. There was a young lady in the congregation in New York. I mean, man, she would just buy into whatever new doctrine she was fed. And so she would come to me, and we would have to talk about, why Muhammad is not God's last prophet. And she, I see that, I see that, I see that. Now she belongs to a Facebook group called Church of Christ Recovery or something like that. And just so disappointing when you see people be wishy-washy like that. Well, I tell you, maybe there's something else here as well that we often find ourselves being discouraged for the same reason, and that is maybe Elijah was expecting too much too fast. You know, it almost seems like he expected he's going to do this really great big thing, and then all of a sudden everything is just going to change automatically. I mean, he is expecting people to have the same zeal as him. In verse 10, he says, I've been very zealous for the Lord, but look at your children. They're not zealous. I mean, maybe he was expecting people to march right to the palace in Samaria and oust Jezebel and Ahab, but that's not what's going to happen. And sometimes that's how we expect. We want to set the world on fire. And it's perfectly fine to want to set the world on fire. But we also have to remember that we have to have some patience and let God do His part of the work as well. It's okay to set high standards. Just be patient while people reach those standards. I mean, that's what I want. I want you to be patient with me when I'm not living up to standards. I think he felt lonely. And who among us hasn't felt lonely at times? You know, you would think that preachers don't ever get lonely. Because, I mean, I don't have to go to a school where I'm the only Christian. I don't have to go to a workplace where I'm the only Christian. But I sometimes have to be in a congregation where nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Or at least it feels that way. And I'm not mean to you guys. But I have been in that situation. There have been some times, I'll just be straight up, there have been some times where I know I was going to preach something a lot of y'all weren't going to like. That's lonely. That's discouraging. But not only that, I mean, you don't have to go to school or go to work and without to be able to look around the world and realize how different we are from everybody else and how lonely it can be just looking around the world and seeing. It's easy for us to think, I'm the only one. What we often do is we let the wickedness of some blind us from the good in others. And I know I do this because my wife tells me I do. But it's true. I know I do that. And that's what Elijah is doing here as well. Bottom line is really that Elijah has his faith is weakened here. And again, it happens to the best of us. And Elijah is a perfect example of that. And anytime our faith grows weak, it's going to lead to discouragement. It's going to even lead to some feelings of depression. So what are we going to do about it? You know, this lesson is not just to make you feel bad, put you down low. It's to help us see what did God do for Elijah to help him to get out of this, what we call funk, right? What did God do? Well, you know, really it begins in verse 11. So let's read 11 to 18, and then we'll start talking about God's cure. So, in verse 10 and verse 9, God starts speaking to him. In verse 10, God says, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore into the mountain and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. So it was when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts because of the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek my life. Then the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael, king of Syria, and you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel-Mariah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. You know, again, what Elijah really needs is just more trust in God. That's really what he needs. And we need to understand that even in our darkest blue of moments, God is a refuge for us. Hold your place here in 1 Kings and turn over to Psalm 9. Psalm 9 is a song of David. And David in this psalm is asking God to take care of his enemies. His enemies are all around him. They are attacking him. The psalmist says that it's to be set to the music of David's dying son. And so it's like, okay, so or the death of the son. So are we talking about Bathsheba's first son, or maybe we're talking about Absalom? But both of those are really dark days in the time of David. And then in verse 9, David says, the Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. And those who know your name will put their trust in you, for you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. And so what does David say in the midst of these trying times? In this lowest of low point in his life, he says, God is a refuge. You know, sometimes we need to go through trials to learn that we can trust God. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He said that God allowed him to have this trial so that he could learn not to trust in men, not to trust in himself, but instead to trust in God who has delivered, does deliver, and will deliver. That's what he learned going through that trial. So we just have to learn to trust more. You know, I think sometimes, you know, if I just said that and just left that and just moved on, it's like, okay, that's really helpful. Like, you know, don't worry, be happy. Okay, yeah. Just singing that song, you know, just solves all the problems, right? Just say, trust God more. That just solves all the problems. But you know, God didn't ever say to Elijah, trust me more. You know what he did? He showed him. He showed him how and why he should trust him more. And so that's what I want us to do. Let's go back and look at what God actually did for Elijah to help Elijah see that he could trust God. And so one of the things that Elijah needed is a greater awareness of God's care for him. So Elijah runs away from Jezebel, goes to the broom tree, falls down, wants to die. And what does God do? He feeds him. Says him, get up and eat. Get up and eat. Where did that food come from? I mean, you know, there wasn't a 24-hour Krispy Kreme right there. This was miraculous food that showed up out of nowhere that God fed him with. Also, did y'all notice that he went on these 2 meals? He went 40 days and 40 nights without eating again? That's kind of amazing. So, what did God do for him at that moment when he's at the lowest low? God provided for him. You know something else that should have done? That should have reminded Elijah that God had been taking care of him even before this. Remember, it hadn't rained for 3.5 years. Where was Elijah during all that time? He was at a widow's house. And when he showed up at her house, she had enough flour and oil to make 1 loaf of bread. And he said, make it for me. And she did. And the flour and the oil was replenished. And that continued to happen every day for 3.5 years. Where did that food come from? It's God taking care of Elijah. And he just needed to be reminded of that. He needed to be reminded that God takes care of people when they trust in Him. And so do we. We need to be reminded of it. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7 that we're supposed to cast our cares upon Him because He cares for you. And I love it, casting all your cares upon Him. When you're depressed, what do you think? Nobody cares. Nobody even notices you. Nobody cares. I think God has stopped caring. It's not true. He can't. There's this great passage in Isaiah where God says, a nursing mother could forget her child, but I cannot forget you. I really did not understand the true meaning of that until we started having babies and Teresa would nurse. And that's when I learned that a nursing mom, if she doesn't feed, that there's pain associated with her not nursing, with the baby not nursing. And so her body hurts when the baby needs to be nursed. She can't forget that. And so God said, that mom might, but I never will. When we think God doesn't care, that's when we need to start singing this song in our head. I'm not going to hurt y'all's ears and sing it, but you know it. Count your many blessings. Name them one by one. And it will surprise you what the Lord has done. There's a friend of mine who, a couple years ago, somebody challenged him to write out 1,000 blessings of God. And they could not repeat. And he said it was a hard and helpful exercise. I thought it sounded really cool, but I've never gotten around to doing it. But I do often think about the blessings that God has given me. Also, Elijah needed to develop a greater awareness of God's power. Maybe he was questioning whether or not God could really topple Jezebel. You know, how is it that he can go out here and kill all these prophets of Baal, and then Jezebel brazenly turn right around and say, I'm going to kill you today? Why wasn't God doing something about her? And so what God needed to do was remind him of his power. So he showed him a wind that broke rocks. He showed him an earthquake that shook that mountain. He showed him a fire that, again, I don't know how hot it was or anything, but it was the fire from God. And we saw how hot the fire from God was last night. And so God is showing him what he can do. And isn't it so cool that he shows him this in nature? Because we have to remember that, God's Word is revelation. It's important. I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. But there's something else that God has given us, and that is His creation. In Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about how the Gentiles are without excuse because they can look around and see the power of God in His creation. He says, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now, there's a lot you can't know about God just through His creation. You can't know how to please Him. You can't know about His mercy. And you can absolutely know something about His power. I think every time we hear about a tsunami or an earthquake, I'm not saying it's an act of God, but every time I hear one or think one and see one, I think that's how powerful God is. One of my favorite things to do in Africa. African sky is just so amazing. We will stand around the campfire after we've talked that day, and this is how we talk to each other. Because you can see the Milky Way. I mean, you can just see so many stars. And I was standing there one night with a young African boy, and I said, how many of those stars' names did you know? And he said, I don't know any. And so I started even pointing out a few. You can see the Southern Cross. And I started pointing out a few. And I said, do you know that God knows the name of every one of them? and that He put every one of those stars up in the sky for you. So Genesis 1 says that they're for the signs and the seasons. They're for us. But that's the power that our God has. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that when we feel helpless, He is in control. The last day of Kelsey's radiation, we knew she was going to have 36 radiation treatments, and that was her best chance at beating that cancer, these radiation treatments. So we're in the radiation waiting room. They wheeled her in for the last radiation treatment, and I prayed to God. I said, well, God, now she's in your hands because radiation is over. And about that quick, I realized how dumb that was. And I prayed, God, please forgive me because I know that she's always been in your hands. And that's when I thought to myself, there's nothing like helplessness to remind you that God has always been in control. And that's what we're supposed to understand when we see His power in His creation around us. Not only did Elijah need a greater awareness of God's power, but he also needed a greater awareness of God's wisdom. I think he was trying to show Elijah how strong he was in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire. But did you notice every time in those three things it said the Lord was not in it? The Lord was not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. But then there is this whispering voice. And that's where God was. God wasn't in the dramatic events. He was in that delicate whisper. And Elijah needed to see that. Because you see, we often want God to work in big, dramatic ways. And it's really rare for God to work in big, dramatic ways. More often what He does is He works in subtle ways. You want to talk about somebody who works the long game? God is one who is always working the long game. He brings about change maybe slower than we would. Think about this. He told Abraham, you're going to have a son, and I'm going to bless you through him. I'm going to bless you through him. I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth through him. How long did it take him to get his first, the true son, Isaac? 25 years, right? How long did it take him to get Jesus? 3,000 years? 4,000 years? And yet, Jesus says that Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He's working the long game. We've got to trust in God's wisdom in that way. Isaiah tells us that God's ways are not our ways. They're higher than ours. They're bigger than ours. And we've got to expect that. You know, there have been times where I've preached sermons and somebody, maybe even the elders have asked me to preach on a subject, and I'll preach on that subject because it is a problem in the congregation, and then somebody will come up to me afterwards and say, we're not going to have a problem with that anymore in this congregation. I'm like, no, time out. One sermon never solves a problem. You know, sometimes really all it does is opens everybody's eyes to the problem, and now sometimes the problem gets worse before it gets better. It's not always the beginning of the solution, but it's never the solution in and of itself. And I think sometimes we start something new, and again, we want to set the world on fire right now. You know, maybe we get bold, and we're going to start doing some personal work, as we call it. We're going to do some evangelism. And we want to just start. We want to set the world on fire today. We want to convert the whole city today. And a week later, we haven't even got anybody to talk to us yet. We're like, I'm done. I'm done. And that's not the way it works. We want to see big things right now, and we become discouraged when they don't happen on our timetable. And we lose sight that what we're doing is good and right. And even if we can't see see the progress, there is progress there. Let me give y'all an example. Now, talk about how big y'all's kids have got. Teresa and I planted 2 trees at the house by the driveway down there. And when we first planted those dudes, I mean, they were sticks, you know, about this high. They look to me, I'm not good at judging height, but they look like they're like 20 feet tall today. But you know, if I lived there, I probably would never notice really them growing that height. It's only when you kind of step back and take that long view. Or if you ever looked at a picture of yourself from 20 years ago and think, man, I'm young. You know? We've got to understand that's the same way it works with God. I said this last night, and I'll repeat it again tonight. Our job is to plant and to water and let God give the increase, and only He can give the increase. There's also something Elijah needed to do. He needed to get busy doing the work of the Lord. He needed greater work. He needed greater activity in the work of the Lord. Well, the first thing, not the first thing, but you know what the Lord said to him in verse 15, the Lord says to him, go, return, do this work. You got a job to do, and get busy doing it. You know, and you know that yourself, that when you get depressed, if you just lay on the couch and not do anything, it gets worse and worse. But if you'll get up and do something, then you feel better. And sometimes that's all we've got to do is just do something. And I think that's one of the reasons why I said last night that don't think you have to do this big thing. You know, give somebody a cup of cold water and you by no means lose your reward. Sometimes I just got to do something, you know. And I think what's really cool is if you'll do something, God will reward you. And here's what I mean. If I would go out and just put my flyers on those bulletin boards, that's all, and nobody talks to me the whole time I'm on that college campus. But it is amazing to me how often that's happened. That's all I did. On Monday, I went and put these flyers up on these, and then lo and behold, somebody reaches out to me through Facebook or meetup.com who wants to come to the study. They didn't see that at all. It's almost like God said, if you'll go work, I'll lead them to you. But if you're not going to work, how's God going to lead somebody to you? You're not going to help them. But if you're showing that you've got a willingness to work, then God's going to... And let me tell you something. We got a lot of work to do, y'all. We got a lot of work to do. In John chapter 4, after Jesus has been talking to the woman at the well, you know, Jesus makes this statement about the harvest that we know well. He says to his disciples, he says, do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. Fields are white for the harvest. There is so much work for us to do. The labor is plentiful and the laborers are few. Somebody asked me the other night, you know, how I feel, how, you know, I live in what is a very liberal place. They don't mind at all being called liberal, you know, to them being called conservative is a cuss word. And somebody asked me, how do you deal with living amongst all those people? And my first answer is this. There are still people looking in Albany, New York. There are people who are looking for God in Albany, New York. And those are the people that I'm looking for. And those are the people who keep me from being discouraged. But let me tell y'all something. How many people in Jonesboro, Arkansas are really looking for the truth? We describe people who believe things very close to us, only a little different enough that I think they're wrong, as liberal, right? There are churches in this community you would call a liberal church. So, aren't you surrounded by just as many liberal people as me. Maybe they're not politically liberal, but they're spiritually liberal. So what's the difference? So you know what? You're looking for the same people I'm looking for. In the same kind of community. You're looking for the people who are looking for God. Get busy looking for them. You know the cathedral in Paris, France, Notre Dame? You know how long it took to build that thing? 182 years. There's a cathedral in Cologne, Germany that took 700 years to build. That meant there were generations of stonecutters who worked their entire life on those buildings and never saw them completed. We are building a spiritual house that will not see its completion until the day Jesus returns. And until He returns, there's too much work to do. To sit around being depressed. And I'm telling Simon that. This passage, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, is printed out and posted to the wall right over my monitor, my computer monitor, so that I see it multiple times every day. It says, "And let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." And when I read that verse, do not lose heart, I think to myself, I do not get depressed. Do not get discouraged. One last point, and then the lesson will be yours, and that is that Elijah needed to develop a greater awareness for God's people. He thought that he was the only one. And God said, no, I've got 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed the knee. I've got 7,000 people in Israel who are still faithful to me. When Paul was in the wicked city of Corinth, that city was so wicked that to behave like a Corinthian meant a bad thing. It was kind of like the Las Vegas of its day. You know, what happens in Corinth stays at Corinth could have been their town motto. That's how bad it was. Paul was there. He got a little depressed. He was by himself. And God says, don't let yourself get down, Paul. I have much people in this city. There were people in Corinth looking for God. And he's telling them, go out there and look. It is important for our own well-being to recognize that even in a world as evil as the one we live in, there are still people trying hard to get to heaven. Even in those horrible times when one of our brethren turns his back on God, there are still people trying to get to heaven. People trying to grow in their faith. And we need each other. We absolutely need each other. That's why we need to be unified. That's why we need to get along. That's why we need to love each other. I mean, who else is going to encourage me when I'm down because people in the world are beating me down than you? Who else is going to encourage you when the world's beating you down but me? We just miss out on one of God's greatest blessings when we don't take advantage of each other. And I'll tell you something. When you live in a community of 800,000 people and there's 20 Christians, you really learn to depend on each other. But again, it's no different for you guys. You just are more blessed. There's more of you to encourage one another. So we should never isolate each other, isolate ourselves from each other. You know, it should never be, and I know I'm talking to people on Wednesday night, I know I'm talking to the choir, as they say, but going to church should never be something I have to do. And it's something I get to do. It's something I want to do. This is one of God's greatest gifts. To have this community of believers to look, we're in this together. Lean on each other. Strengthen each other. Sharpen each other. You see your brother and he looks depressed, talk to him. And don't try to toughen him up. Love on him. Because that's what he really needs. I want to say this, just so that nobody gets the wrong idea. I'm not trying to minimize depression. I know that there is a real sickness called depression. I believe it. I've seen it. I've dealt with people who deal with it. And I know it can be a real big problem for people in their lives. And we need to remember that as we deal with people who are in depressed states, to help them with their soul as well. But here's what I firmly believe. The true answer to depression and discouragement is found in God alone. We need His power. We need to see His power. We need to be reminded of His power. We need to be reminded of His care. We need to be reminded of His control. We need to be reminded of His wisdom. And we need to learn to find strength and courage and comfort in one another. Most importantly, and if you don't get anything else out of this lesson, get this. If you feel discouraged in this church, get busy. Stop whining about what's wrong and get busy fixing it. Whatever it might be. Trusting in the Lord. I tell you, a lot of times what depression is for Christians is it's really guilt. Because we know there's sin in our life that we need to deal with and haven't dealt with. And so what a great opportunity you have tonight. If there's sin in your life, you need to get rid of it. You need to deal with it. You need to change. And I promise you this, we all know how that feels. And so if you're willing to confess that and repent of that, I promise you, more than one person is going to say, man, I love you. I've been right there. Let me help you get through this. I know that because I've heard it being said to me. And I've had opportunity to say it to other people. And if you hear this tonight and you're not a Christian, well, you know there's sin in your life. And you need to fix that as well. And you'll never be right with God. You'll never be right with yourself until you're right with God. So do what you need to do to find the comfort that only God can give and forgiveness. And if we can help you in any way, why don't you come right now as we stand and have this. All things are